The Kansas summer sun beat down mercilessly on the endless sea of prairie grass, turning the landscape into waves of gold and amber that shimmered with heat. Emma Hartwell wiped the sweat from her forehead with a dirty sleeve and squinted against the glare, searching for the calf that had wandered away from her small herd that morning. At 16 years old, Emma had been managing the failing homestead alone for nearly a year since her parents died from cholera, and every lost animal represented a potential catastrophe she could barely afford. The calf meant milk, meat, or money she desperately needed to survive. Another season on land that seemed determined to defeat her. Emma's homestead sat on a remote claim that her father had staked 5 years earlier with dreams of prosperity that had never materialized. The soil was difficult, water was scarce, and isolation meant that help was always too far away when it was needed most. Her parents had worked themselves to exhaustion trying to make the land productive, and when illness came, there had been no doctor, no medicine, and no time to save them. Emma had buried them both behind the cabin, marking their graves with rough wooden crosses, and then faced the reality that she was completely alone with skills barely adequate for survival and resources that dwindled with each passing week. As Emma walked through the tall grass, following tracks that might or might not belong to her missing calf, she noticed something unusual on the horizon, dark shapes circling in the sky, dropping lower with each rotation, the unmistakable silhouette of crows gathering for a feast. Emma's stomach turned as she recognized the pattern. Something was dying out there and the scavengers knew it. She altered her course toward the circling birds, half hoping it was just a deer or coyote that had succumbed to the heat, half dreading what she might actually find. What Emma discovered made her stop so abruptly she nearly fell. About 50 yards away, staked to the ground in a spread eagle position, was a human figure. A man, clearly Native American based on his clothing and appearance, lying motionless under the brutal sun while crows hopped closer, emboldened by his stillness. Emma's first instinct was to turn around and leave immediately, to pretend she had seen nothing and return to her search for the calf. Everything she had been taught about survival on the frontier screamed that this was not her problem, that interfering could bring danger she was ill-equipped to handle. But Emma found herself walking forward despite her fear, drawn by something she could not quite name. Compassion, maybe, or simple human decency that refused to let her walk away from suffering, even when self-preservation argued she should. As she drew closer, details emerged that made the scene even more disturbing. The warrior had been deliberately staked out, his wrists and ankles bound with rawhide to wooden stakes driven deep into the hard earth. His traditional Apache clothing was torn and stained with blood from wounds that appeared to be several days old. His face was sunburned and swollen, lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. And his breathing was so shallow, Emma initially thought he might already be dead. Emma knelt beside the warrior, her hands shaking as she reached out to check for a pulse. She found one, faint and irregular, a stubborn heartbeat that refused to quit despite circumstances that should have ended it days ago. The warrior's eyes remained closed, showing no awareness of Emma's presence, but she could see his chest rising and falling with painful effort. Someone had left this man to die slowly and cruelly, staked out for the sun, dehydration, and scavengers to finish what violence had started. Emma felt rage building alongside her fear, anger at the casual cruelty that could treat a human being this way. Looking at the stakes holding the warrior's limbs, Emma realized they had been driven in with considerable force and expertise. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing, maximizing suffering while ensuring the victim could not escape. Emma pulled at one of the stakes, but it would not budge, the wood driven too deep into the sun-hardened earth. She would need tools to free him, time she did not have if she was going to get him to shelter, before the elements finished what his captors had started. More immediately, she needed water to keep him alive long enough to attempt rescue. Emma ran back to where she had left her horse, grabbed her water canteen, and returned to the staked warrior. She lifted his head carefully and dribbled water onto his cracked lips, speaking softly even though she did not know if he could hear. The warrior's throat worked reflexively, swallowing the precious liquid, and Emma felt a surge of hope that he might be saved if she acted quickly. She gave him more water, then assessed the situation with the practical mindset that a year of solo survival had taught her. She could not free him alone without tools. and leaving to get tools meant leaving him vulnerable to the elements and scavengers for however long it took her to return. The decision was made for her by the weather. Emma looked toward the western horizon and felt her heart sink. Dark clouds were building there, the kind of massive thunderhead that brought the violent storms Kansas was famous for. The storm would hit in hours, maybe less, bringing rain that could save the warrior's life through hydration, but also lightning that could kill them both if they were caught in the open, and winds that could turn the prairie into a deadly place to be without shelter. Emma had to make a choice immediately. Attempt to free the warrior and move him to safety before the storm hit, or abandon the effort and retreat to her own cabin before the weather made travel impossible. Emma chose to try, though she knew it was probably foolish and possibly fatal. She could not walk away and leave another human being staked out to face a prairie storm alone. She ran to her horse again, this time gathering every tool she had brought: a small axe, a knife, rope, and a blanket. The approaching storm gave her perhaps 2 hours to work with, maybe 3 if she was lucky. Emma returned to the warrior and began the exhausting work of chopping and digging at the stakes, using the axe blade to loosen the hard-packed earth around each one. The physical labor was punishing in the heat, and Emma had to stop frequently to give both herself and the unconscious warrior more water from her rapidly depleting supply. After what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 40 minutes, Emma finally freed the warrior's wrists. His arms fell limply to his sides, and Emma saw with horror the deep wounds the rawhide bindings had carved into his flesh, cutting through to bone in places where he had struggled against his restraints. She moved to his ankles, working with desperate speed as the storm clouds grew larger and the wind began to pick up, carrying the metallic scent of approaching rain. Finally, mercifully, the last stake came free, and the warrior was no longer bound to the earth that had been his intended grave. But freeing him was only the first problem. The warrior was considerably larger than Emma and completely unconscious, making him nearly impossible for her to move alone. Emma tried to lift him, failed, then tried dragging him toward her horse with marginal success. The approaching storm was now visible as a wall of darkness moving across the prairie, lightning flickering within the clouds like trapped fire. Emma knew she was running out of time and options. Her cabin was too far to reach before the storm hit. Her only chance was to find some kind of shelter closer, somewhere they could weather the worst of it before attempting the longer journey home. Emma remembered a rocky outcropping about half a mile east, a place where erosion had created a small overhang that might provide minimal protection. It was not much, but it was the only option available. With strength born from desperation and determination, Emma managed to get the warrior onto her horse, draping him across the saddle while she led the animal on foot. The journey to the rocks was nightmarish, with Emma constantly adjusting the warrior's weight to keep him from sliding off, her own exhaustion making every step feel like wading through deep water. The storm was nearly upon them when Emma finally reached the outcropping and pulled the warrior into the shallow shelter, just as the first fat raindrops began to fall and the wind rose to a howl that seemed to shake the very earth. The storm hit with the full fury that Kansas weather was famous for, transforming the prairie from sun-baked stillness to violent chaos in minutes. Rain fell in sheets so dense that Emma could barely see beyond the rocky overhang that provided their meager shelter. Wind howled across the open grassland with a force that bent the tall prairie grass flat and sent debris flying through the air like projectiles. Lightning split the sky with brilliant white cracks that illuminated the landscape in strobing flashes, followed by thunder so loud it seemed to vibrate through Emma's bones and rattle her teeth. Emma huddled in the shallow space beneath the rock overhang, using her body to shield the unconscious warrior from the worst of the rain that blew sideways into their shelter. She had spread her blanket over both of them, but it was quickly soaked through and provided little protection against the deluge. The warrior remained completely unresponsive, his breathing still shallow and labored, his body burning with fever that Emma could feel even through their wet clothing. She continued to give him water when she could. Now supplemented by rainwater, she caught in her cupped hands, desperately trying to rehydrate him, while also keeping them both from drowning in the storm. The violence of the weather was terrifying in its intensity. Lightning struck close enough that Emma could smell the ozone and feel the electric charge in the air raising the hair on her arms. One bolt hit a solitary tree about 100 yards away, splitting it down the middle with a crack that sounded like a cannon shot. The rain was so heavy that water began pooling in low areas, turning the prairie into a temporary lake in places where drainage could not keep pace with the downpour. Emma realized with growing dread that their rocky shelter, while protecting them from the worst of the wind, was positioned in a slight depression that was beginning to collect water. As the water level rose around them, Emma knew they would have to move or risk drowning in what had seemed like their salvation. But moving during the height of the storm would expose them to lightning strikes and flying debris that could be just as deadly. Emma made the calculation that staying was slightly less dangerous than going. Hand focused her energy on keeping the warrior's head elevated above the rising water, while using her blanket as a crude barrier to redirect some of the flow away from their position. It was exhausting work that required constant adjustment and vigilance, and Emma felt her strength ebbing with each passing minute. But she refused to give up, refused to let the storm claim them after she had worked so hard to save the warrior from his original fate. Emma talked to the unconscious man, not knowing if he could hear but needing the sound of her own voice to maintain her courage and focus. She told him he had to keep fighting, that she had not freed him just to let him die in a storm, that whatever had brought him to this place and situation, he deserved better than to perish without even knowing someone had tried to help him. Her words were as much for herself as for him, a reminder of why she had chosen to intervene despite the risks and the costs. The storm raged for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 90 minutes of sustained fury before gradually beginning to diminish. The rain softened from deluge to steady downpour, the wind dropped from howling gale to strong gusts, and the lightning moved off toward the eastern horizon, its flashes becoming more distant and less threatening. Emma sagged with relief as she realized they had survived the worst of it, though both were completely soaked, chilled despite the summer temperature, and exhausted from the ordeal. The warrior's fever seemed to have broken during the storm, possibly from the forced cooling of the rain, and his breathing appeared slightly stronger and more regular. As the weather continued to clear and evening approached, Emma assessed their situation with the practical mindset that survival demanded. They were both thoroughly wet and would need to get dry and warm before hypothermia could set in once night fell. The warrior needed medical attention beyond the basic care Emma could provide in the field, including treatment for his wounds, proper rehydration, and rest in a safe environment. Emma's cabin was still several miles away, too far to attempt with night approaching, and the prairie turned to mud by the storm. They would need to spend the night here and attempt the journey at first light when conditions would be safer, and visibility better. Emma gathered what dry material she could, find beneath overhangs and in protected crevices of the rocky outcropping, using the small amount of relatively dry wood and grass to build a modest fire in a sheltered spot. It took considerable effort, with her limited fire-starting supplies and everything damp from the storm, but Emma's persistence eventually produced a small flame that she carefully nursed into something more substantial. The fire provided warmth and a psychological comfort that helped offset the isolation and vulnerability of spending the night in the open prairie with an unconscious stranger who might or might not survive until morning, as darkness fell and the sky cleared to reveal stars emerging between dispersing clouds. Emma positioned herself and the warrior as close to the fire as safety allowed, trying to dry their clothes and warm their bodies. She checked his wounds by firelight, cleaning them as best she could with rainwater and strips torn from her already ruined dress. The injuries were serious, showing signs of infection that worried Emma deeply, but at least the bleeding had mostly stopped, and the rawhide burns on his wrists and ankles could now be properly examined and treated, albeit crudely with the limited resources available. The warrior stirred for the first time since Emma had found him, a small groan escaping his lips as some level of consciousness began to return. His eyes flickered open briefly, unfocused and confused, taking in the fire, the night sky, and Emma's face leaning over him with concern. He tried to speak, his voice a harsh rasp that produced no intelligible words before his eyes closed again, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. But those few seconds of awareness gave Emma hope that he might actually survive, that her desperate efforts to save him had not been in vain. Emma kept watch through the night, feeding the fire and monitoring the warrior's condition, dozing occasionally, but never deeply enough to miss any change in his breathing or movement. She thought about what had led to this moment, about the choices she had made and the potential consequences she would face. Helping the warrior meant she might become a target for whoever had staked him out, might face accusations of harboring an enemy, might complicate her already precarious existence on the frontier. But Emma also knew that she would make the same choice again, that some decisions were about defining who you were rather than calculating optimal outcomes. As dawn broke over the storm-washed prairie, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emma prepared to attempt the journey back to her cabin. The warrior was still unconscious, but seemed more stable, his fever remaining down and his breathing steady. Emma fashioned a crude travois using branches and her rope, creating a frame she could attach to her horse to drag the warrior across the muddy terrain without having to carry his full weight. It was not ideal, but it was the best solution available given their circumstances and her limited physical strength. The journey back to the cabin took most of the morning, with Emma having to stop frequently to rest her horse, adjust the travois, and check on her patient. The prairie was transformed by the storm, with water standing in low areas and the grass looking greener and more vibrant after the thorough soaking. Emma's missing calf was long forgotten, a minor concern compared to the much larger responsibility she had taken on by deciding to save the dying warrior. When her cabin finally came into view over a small rise, Emma felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She had done it. Against all odds and obstacles, she had brought them both home alive. Nathan's planned departure was set for early morning, when visibility would be good, but before the heat of the day made travel unnecessarily difficult. Emma prepared supplies with care: dried meat, hardtack, water, and a bedroll that Nathan could use during the journey to his people. She also provided her father's old hat and a worn coat that would help Nathan look less distinctly Apache from a distance, possibly buying him precious time if spotted by bounty hunters or patrols who watched the territory for escaped prisoners or unauthorized movement. The night before his departure, Emma and Nathan sat outside the cabin watching stars emerge in the clear Kansas sky. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and indifferent to human struggles, a landscape that had witnessed countless stories of survival, failure, courage, and tragedy. Nathan spoke about his gratitude, not just for Emma saving his life, but for treating him with dignity and respect when others had seen him as something less than human. He told her that her courage in standing against the storm, both the weather and the social expectations that would have counseled abandoning him, represented the best of what any person could be, regardless of their background or culture. Emma responded that Nathan had given her something equally valuable: the knowledge that she was capable of more than she had believed, that her compassion and determination were strengths rather than weaknesses, and that the frontier's harshness had not destroyed her ability to see people as individuals rather than categories. She said that meeting him had challenged prejudices she had not even known she carried, and that she would be forever different because of the choice she made to help him and the conversations they had shared during his recovery. As dawn broke and the time for departure arrived, Nathan prepared to leave with a mix of relief at the prospect of rejoining his people and reluctance to say goodbye to the person who had saved him. Emma helped him onto her horse, wincing at how much the movement still pained him despite significant healing. They had agreed that Nathan would ride the horse as far as the creek that marked the western boundary of Emma's claim, then continue on foot, sending the horse back with items tied to the saddle that would guide the animal home. It was not a perfect plan, but it gave Nathan the best chance of covering enough distance before his injuries forced him to rest. Emma walked alongside the horse for the first mile, neither of them speaking much, both seemingly reluctant to voice the finality of this goodbye. When they reached a small rise that offered a good view of the surrounding territory, Nathan reined in the horse and looked back at Emma's cabin, visible as a small structure in the distance. He spoke in Apache, words that Emma did not understand but which sounded like a blessing or prayer. Then he translated. He had asked the spirits to protect Emma and watch over her homestead, repaying her courage with the good fortune she deserved for her compassionate heart. Emma felt tears prickling at her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Unwilling to make this moment harder than it already was, she told Natan to ride safely, to reach his people, and to remember that not all settlers were enemies, just as she would remember that not all Native Americans were the dangerous savages she had been taught to fear. Natan nodded, squeezed Emma's hand briefly in farewell, then turned the horse westward and began riding toward the horizon, where his people waited in their seasonal camps beyond the reach of territorial authorities and bounty hunters. Emma stood watching until Natan disappeared over a distant rise, then turned back toward her cabin, feeling the full weight of her isolation settling over her once again. The homestead that had felt alive with conversation and shared purpose for the past weeks now seemed emptier than ever, a reminder of all she had lost with her parents' deaths and all she was unlikely to ever have living alone on this remote claim. But Emma also felt something new and unexpected, pride in what she had done, satisfaction in knowing she had lived up to values that mattered more than survival or social approval. Several hours after Natan had left, Emma's horse returned to the cabin as planned. The items Natan had tied to the saddle serving as confirmation he had reached the creek and continued his journey on foot. Emma unsaddled the tired animal and saw that Natan had left something unexpected, the small leather pouch he had worn around his neck, the one Emma had carefully avoided disturbing when treating his wounds. Attached to it was a note written in careful English on a scrap of paper Emma had provided for his use. The note explained that the pouch contained a small turquoise stone that was sacred to his people, symbolizing protection and good fortune. Natan wanted Emma to have it as thanks for her courage, and as a reminder that they would always be connected by the choice she had made to see him as a person worthy of saving rather than an enemy, to be feared or abandoned. Emma held the turquoise stone in her palm, feeling its smooth surface and admiring its beautiful blue-green color. It was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given her, not because of monetary worth, but because of what it represented: recognition, respect, and a bond that transcended all the divisions that society tried to enforce between their peoples. Emma carefully placed the stone on a shelf where she could see it daily, a tangible reminder that courage mattered, that compassion changed lives, and that she had stood against the storm in every sense of the word. The weeks that followed Natan's departure brought challenges that tested Emma's resolve and resources. Word had spread through the sparse settler community about a missing Apache prisoner, and bounty hunters occasionally passed through the area asking questions and searching for signs of their escaped captive. Emma told no lies when questioned, but volunteered no information either, maintaining that she had seen nothing unusual and knew nothing about escaped prisoners. Her isolation and youth worked in her favor, with most questioners assuming she was too insignificant and ignorant to be involved in anything as dramatic as hiding a fugitive. But one bounty hunter proved more persistent and suspicious than the others. A man named Crandall stopped at Emma's homestead on a hot August afternoon, his eyes scanning the property with professional assessment while asking questions that seemed casual, but were clearly designed to trap her in inconsistencies. Crandall noted fresh repairs to the cabin that looked recent, supplies that seemed more abundant than a struggling orphan girl should possess, and a horse that appeared to have been ridden hard in the not-too-distant past. His suspicions were aroused, and Emma knew that denial alone would not satisfy him. Emma made a decision that was either brilliant or foolish, depending on how events unfolded. She told Crandall a version of the truth, explaining that she had found an injured man on the prairie after the big storm, had helped him recover out of Christian charity, and had provided basic supplies before he continued his journey. She deliberately left ambiguous whether the man was Native American, white, or anything else, painting the encounter as simple humanitarian aid rather than politically charged assistance to an escaped prisoner. Crandall pressed for more details, but Emma stuck to her story with enough conviction that he eventually left, though not without warning her that helping escaped prisoners carried serious consequences. After Crandall departed, Emma felt the full weight of what she had risked by helping Natan. If Crandall reported his suspicions to territorial authorities, Emma could face investigation, possible loss of her homestead, or even criminal charges. But she also knew that she could not have made a different choice, that walking away from Natan would have violated something fundamental about who she was and who she wanted to be. The turquoise stone on her shelf served as a reminder that some things were worth the risk. That courage meant acting according to your values, even when it cost you safety or security. Months passed without further incident, and Emma gradually relaxed, believing that the immediate danger had passed. Her homestead continued its precarious existence, with Emma barely managing to keep food on the table and maintain the property. But she endured, drawing strength from the knowledge that she had survived both the physical storm that nearly killed her and Nathan, and the social storm that threatened her standing and safety in the community. She had discovered reserves of courage and capability she had not known she possessed, and that self-knowledge made the isolation and hardship more bearable. Nearly a year after Nathan's departure, Emma was working in her garden when she noticed riders approaching her cabin. Her heart sank, fearing that Crandall or other bounty hunters had returned with more questions or accusations. But as the riders drew closer, Emma saw they were not the rough white men she had expected. They were Apache, 3 warriors riding calmly toward her property, with no visible weapons drawn and postures that suggested peaceful intentions rather than hostile approach. Emma stood her ground, her hand near the rifle she kept close when working outside, but she did not raise the weapon. The riders stopped at a respectful distance, and one of them called out in English asking if she was Emma Hartwell. When Emma confirmed her identity, the rider dismounted and approached slowly, speaking carefully in practiced English. He explained that he was from Nathan's band, that Nathan had returned safely, and told his people about the young white woman who had saved his life and treated him with honor when others had shown only cruelty. The band wanted to express gratitude and offer Emma protection, acknowledging the debt they owed to someone who had risked everything for one of their own. The warrior presented Emma with gifts, beautifully tanned hides, dried meat prepared by traditional methods that would keep for months, and seeds for crops that grew well in difficult prairie conditions. He also delivered a message from Nathan saying that he often thought of Emma and the courage she had shown, that he hoped she was well, and that her homestead was prospering, and that she would always be considered a friend to his people, welcome at their camps, and protected by their warriors if she ever needed help. Emma accepted the gifts with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by this unexpected recognition and by the knowledge that her choice to help Nathan had created bonds that extended far beyond their brief time together. Years later, when Emma's homestead had evolved from barely surviving to actually thriving, she would tell the story of the storm to the few friends who earned her trust enough to hear it. She would describe finding a dying warrior left for the crows, making the choice to save him despite knowing it could destroy her, and discovering that courage meant standing for your values even when the world said you should look away. The turquoise stone remained on her shelf throughout her life, a reminder that the most important moments often came from the hardest choices, and that compassion in the face of cruelty was never wasted even when it cost everything you thought you could not afford to lose. Emma had stood against the storm, both the weather that nearly killed them and the social forces that said she should have walked away. In doing so, she had discovered who she truly was and what she was capable of becoming. The dying Apache warrior had been left to the crows, but an orphan girl had refused to let that be the end of his story, and in saving him, she had saved something essential in herself as well.